In this tutorial, we'll look at and explore anatomical start position, and really what references can we use to really establish and acquire a good standing in start position from an anatomical observation. So initially, looking at really how we place and position ourselves through foot and ankle. So the foot and ankle, from a much more precise segment discussion, we'll look at more detail in a different tutorial, but certainly for the benefit of this kind of more global observation of setup today, when it comes to really establishing kind of foot position, a very intuitive way and certainly a very kind of responsive way to really kind of establish really nice foot and ankle placement. Initially, just start to march through the spot, so kind of marching on both feet. And as you continue stamping and marching, just allow the feet then just to slightly start to walk out and almost widen the space between the ankles. So as you march through both feet, just start to walk out through both foot and ankle, pretty much until the ankle joint sits underneath the hip joint. So this is very much dependent on, say, bone structure, bone configuration, even gender-based differences. For example, the pelvis can be very, very different widths and thicknesses depending on the human, the gender, for example. So, but from a very kind of global normative reference that we can use, really from the feet together, just start to march and stamp on the spot. As you march, just slowly start to walk the feet out, pretty much until the ankle's under the hip joint or ankle under armpit, depending on what reference you wish to use. And in a very kind of playful, intuitive way, that can actually start to establish and then help us then place the feet anatomically in a nice position then to move from. There's other approaches we can use as well. Often what I use is to have people jump as high as they can, and when they land, objectively and certainly intently try and land with the feet beneath, again, the armpit or hip joint. So feet together, jump and land. Once more, where the feet land from a foot placement and foot position discussion is that very intuitive, almost kind of fight or flight approach in some ways, playful way of establishing foot position. But like said, the actual precise segment awareness of the foot is something we'll look at and discuss in a different tutorial. So then when it comes to kind of bending into our start position or really bending into that position of address, initially with fingers or maybe even the index finger or ring finger, at the front of the pelvis we have two very prominent dominant bony references. They're called the AS-IS, or for those that are more anatomically aware, the anterior superior iliac spine. So they're bony references at the front of the pelvis. In my case today for the tutorial, they sit just beneath my belt line. So I'll use my middle finger just to kind of place on that bony reference at the start. With about a kind of 1 or 2 inch bend through the knee, using that kind of middle finger, just glide the pelvis back by, in essence, just pushing and actively moving the AS-IS backwards. So from the side on target line view, foot under ankle or kind of ankle under hip joint, little 2 inch bend in the knee, using the fingers, just glide the AS-IS backwards. So in essence, the pelvis rotates over the kind of long femur, or to be very precise, the femoral head that sits into the hip joint. So once we've established foot placement, 2 inch bend in the knee, using those fingers, just glide the pelvis backwards to help find that start position through the pelvis. Really what we're trying to avoid when bending forwards is to either bend through the lumbar spine, so it's something we call actually lumbar flexion rather than hip flexion, or equally so, as we bend forwards, we really extend and elevate that thoracic spine or rib cage. So the more precise postural imbalances that we can see in the start position, once more, something we'll explore in a lot more detail and a much more precise, refined way in future tutorials. For example, what is lumbar flexion or what is thoracic extension? But certainly for the purpose of this more global tutorial today, once the feet have been established, 2 inch bend in the knee, glide the pelvis back so the pelvis bends and rotates over the long femur or the hip joint, rather than bending from the lumbar spine or extending through that thoracic spine. Finally, when it comes to looking at kind of lower limb alignment, once we've established the foot placement, once we then kind of bend forward into our start position, without adapting the feet, so very much without moving towards that supinated inverted foot and ankle position, so still keeping the pressure fairly matched and even through both feet. Almost no more than a 1 or 2 degree external rotation outwards of that long femur or knee. So we're not looking for huge amounts of rotation outwards or real active and very evident rotation outwards. Once we're in that kind of nice forward bend position, using those long femurs, just very sensitively and very discreetly rotate them out around about kind of 2 or 3 degrees. Now there's many anatomical reasons why we encourage this, 2 of which would be that when we rotate the femurs outwards slightly, it gives us much more space and much more width across the pelvis. So in essence, the pelvis can have the almost that intrinsic reference of actually widening through the front or the anterior part of the pelvis. So in essence, that gives the hip joints much more usable range to play with. In addition to that, and this very much depends on the individual, so it very much will connect back to the response that you have as an individual when doing this. When those femurs just slightly rotate outwards, we can get slightly more awareness and a bit more activity and slight more almost engagement of those big hip extensor muscles at the back, so glute max, glute med, and glute minimus, the muscles that really control and help the pelvis produce rotation through swing. So we're looking then more at kind of upper body, kind of rib cage, spine, hand and arm and scap. Standing nice and tall, so almost a reference I give people, almost going back to the start of this tutorial today, that whatever height you are, so in my case I'm 5'8", 5'9", it's almost standing, when you stand it's set up to almost be an inch taller or half an inch taller than you need to be. So in my case it's trying to be kind of 5'9.5" or 5'10" in standing, rather than that slightly kind of rounded, almost slightly compressive approach we can have. So in that start position, once we've really established lower limb, it's being very aware of that long spine, or in my case, a 5'10" inch human length spine, rather than that kind of very 5'8", 5'9" position. So when we're in our start position, long through the spine at address. When we breathe in, so it's very important when breathing, and breathing is something we'll really start to look at and discuss in much more detail again in individual tutorials. It's breathing almost laterally out through the bottom part of the rib cage. So through the rib cage here, the rib cage starts to expand and open up. Breath in many ways is how much can we breathe out, but it really in that kind of 360 or 3-dimensional way. Breathe outwards, breathe backwards and breathe forward. So the whole lumbar spine, bottom part of the rib cage in many ways expands and contracts in that 3-dimensional way on the out breath and the in breath. So once we're in that very long spine, as we bend forwards, as we breathe in, being very aware that we really breathe into and out through those bottom ribs, through the tummy, through that lumbar spine. Why that's so important is then on the out breath, as we breathe outwards, it's just allowing the rib cage to be very precise, the sternum or the xiphoid process, which is the bone at the bottom of that kind of breastplate sternum area. That as we breathe outwards, just allow the rib cage just to drop downwards. So we're not talking about rounding forwards or increasing the kyphosis in that kind of thoracic spine. Just on the out breath, it's just allowing that rib cage just to drop downwards. Now for many, many reasons, it almost in some ways reconnects through the diaphragm, the rib cage and the pelvis. And for many people, there's a separation or a disconnect of really how the rib cage is moving within functional movement alongside how the pelvis is also moving. So often when we stand in these very extended, very kind of long, almost 2 upright positions, we can actually disconnect how the pelvis moves from how the rib cage moves. So a way of really almost reconnecting and ensuring that the pelvis and rib cage move and function together is on the out breath. It's allowing that rib cage just to gently drop downwards. So again, on a scale, a little bit like the femurs from the lower limb observation, we're talking 2 or 3 degrees at best. So just to go through that once more, long spine, in my case, the idea being 5'8", so long neck, long upper spine, really kind of long lumbar spine pelvis area. As we breathe in through the tummy, through the back, through the bottom ribs, on the out breath, it's allowing that rib cage just to drop downwards. And then finally, when looking at hand and arm position, once you've established lower limb, once we're into that nice rib cage pelvis connection at address, almost gently externally rotating the forearm and the hand outward. So maybe from the face on position, using the right arm perhaps as a reference for this tutorial, bicep facing forwards, just gently externally rotate the forearms outwards. And then once the upper arm, scapula, neck, biceps in position, then we can just start to rotate the forearms back to that very biomechanical definition of zero, which for many people, the biomechanical reference of zero being when the radius styloid or the snuff box, depending on which reference you wish to use, is in line with the middle of the elbow. So that would be supination. Equally, this would be pronation. So just to help establish the arm, scapula, ribcage, neck position once more. Bicep forwards, thumbs, forearms slightly externally rotated without then moving the upper arm or bicep or humeral position or the scapular position. Then just rotate the hands and arms back to where the radius styloid is in line with the middle of the elbow joint. And then from here then we can start to position and place the hands onto the golf club.
Add in some numerical values as far as the forward bend of the pelvis, thorax and head. So you'll see here how sequentially, if you look at the bottom value moving upwards, the head sits further forwards than the rib cage and the rib cage sits further forwards than the head. But it's a fairly scaled forward bend sequence that the pelvis sits forwards, typically using very, very orthopedic normative ranges, which I dislike on many reasons, almost on every reason, but certainly for the purpose of this anatomical tutorial, typically around about kind of 15 to 20 degrees of forward bend in the pelvis would fit within almost expected orthopedic ranges. Equally then, so around about kind of high 30s to low 40s of thorax bend, and then finally kind of mid to kind of high 50s of kind of head bends. So the idea that the rib cage sits slightly further forward than the pelvis, and then equally the head sits slightly further forward, it's set up than the rib cage. Then looking at the lateral flexion or the side bend, depending on which reference one wishes to use, is how the lead hip or the lead side of the pelvis is slightly more elevated than the trail side. Equally so then how the spine or the rib cage is slightly orientated or laterally flexed to the right alongside the head once again. But once more, fairly equal matching of those segments as far as how much lateral flexion or bend in those segments at address. What we don't see typically in real imbalanced lateral or frontal plane orientations, as you'll see here, is, for example, the right side of the pelvis is elevated, yet the rib cage is laterally flexed or side bend to the right. And then looking at the position or the orientation of both the lead and trail humerus, you'll see here almost through animation how vertically downwards both of those humeruses hang at address, which then really represents a wonderfully connected and wonderfully matched position of the scapula on the rib cage. Looking at the numerical values, almost equal amounts of trail and lead shoulder flexion at address at both are hanging, almost identical values at setup. So once more, again, what we really look to avoid with anatomy are real dominance or imbalances. For example, when the lead arm is a lot more extended at address, or vice versa, the trail arm from a shoulder flexion extension position, the trail shoulder, for example, is more flexed or extended on either side. So much more even matching of those two values or both humeruses at address, which is really shown by the animation here, how vertical the lead and trail humerus are at setup.
So really kind of walking through those main references once more. To establish foot position, stamp both feet. As you stamp, just walk outwards pretty much until ankle under hip, ankle under armpit. 2-inch bend through the knee. Using the fingers, glide the pelvis backwards so we very much bend in and around those hip joints. And then with the femur, that slight external rotation outwards, only maybe 1 or 2 degrees at best. The idea in my case of that, having that very long spine, long neck, so avoiding the kind of head forwards or the head into that very extended cervical position at address. So long neck, long spine. On the in-breath, breathe out through the bottom part of the ribs, through the belly, through the back. On the out-breath, just allowing that rib cage to drop downwards, biceps forwards, thumbs out, externally rotate the arms, then rotate the forearms into position. Therefore, we can place the hands on the club. So I hope this helps as a global reference and global understanding of the start position. Much more precise anatomical segments, for example, the feet, the scapula, the spine, we'll look at and explore in individual tutorials through the Academy.